Howdy. Now we're going to move on to the second lecture of Module 13 and talk about the politics of judicial decision making. We just finished a discussion of the politics of selection, and if the myth of judicial objectivity were not a myth, if it were actually true, then it wouldn't make any difference. Going through all of those machinations and political considerations wouldn't matter because all judges would come to the same conclusion. But we know that's not the case. And as it turns out, political scientists have discovered substantial evidence that it does matter who is appointed, and that the judges' personal political preferences affect decision making. So here's some evidence. First of all, we know that Supreme Court justices form distinct voting blocks based on ideology. Now, the way we measure ideology is we look at their votes and how they cast votes on cases in which they participate. And we analyze those votes and put them into scales in much the same way that we analyze votes cast by members of Congress on the floor of the House and Senate. And so here's one way to look at it. What this chart does is that it lists the current Supreme Court justices, and others that have served recently. And the scale is just a simple measure of an analysis that some political scientists have done, looking at civil liberties cases and then coding whether a vote for the defendant or for the plaintiff was a vote in support of civil liberties. And so what this chart does, it just reports the percentage of pro-civil liberty votes cast by each justice over the course of their career. Now, so what we know from this analysis of the court that existed at the beginning of 2016, there were three distinct blocks. There was a liberal bloc consisting of justices appointed by Democratic presidents, Justice Sotomayor, Justice Kagan, Justice Ginsburg, and Justice Breyer. There was also a conservative bloc of justices, all appointed by Republicans, and these consisted of Chief Justice Roberts, Alito, Scalia, and Thomas. And then Justice Anthony Kennedy was a moderate, although he voted with the conservatives more often than he voted with the liberals. And notice that I have put a question mark by Roberts because in recent sessions, Chief Justice Roberts has been voting less conservative than he did in his first years on the court. And so here is an analysis where I just calculated the average the average percentage of votes on which the conservative justices voted in favor of the individual and civil liberties, and the average number of votes, liberal votes by the Democratic justices. Now, I want to consider how recent changes have altered the ideological balance of the Supreme Court. Or notice that I say may have here because a lot of this is based on estimates and in some cases just pure speculation. So we'll have to wait and see exactly how this plays out after the justices have cast votes over several years. But here are some of the recent changes. First of all, Justice Scalia died in February of 2016, and his seat was vacant. And then in 2018, Justice Kennedy retired. And so here is a depiction of the liberalism of Supreme Court justices as of January 2016. So let's combine it, taking those replacements out, so we can see it on the same scale. Now, Justice Scalia unexpectedly died in February of 2016. This was 10 months before the election. President Obama nominated a well-qualified appellate court judge, Merrick Garland, to fill the seat. But the Republican-controlled Senate refused to even consider the nominee because it was an election year, and argued that we should wait till after the election to fill that seat, to let whoever was elected president fill that seat. As we know now, President Trump won that election, and so when he took office in 2016, he had the opportunity to fill that seat with Scalia's departure, and he appointed Neil Gorsuch. Now, this estimate of 29% liberal votes on civil liberties cases is an estimate. It's based on very few votes, and also an analysis of how often he voted with different justices. But so far it looks like that Justice Gorsuch is voting very much like Scalia did, and so that appointment didn't alter the ideological balance on the court. 4 solid liberals, 3 solid conservatives, and Justice Roberts used to be one of the solid conservatives, but as I said, in recent terms, he has been voting a little more moderately. But then in 2018, Justice Kennedy, who had been the median justice, the justice that would determine whether a case went in the liberal direction or the conservative direction, depending on how he voted. And so Justice Kennedy announced his retirement in 2018, creating a vacancy, which President Trump filled with Brett Kavanaugh. And there are Justice Kavanaugh has cast even fewer votes than Justice Gorsuch. But based on how he has voted so far, it looks like Kavanaugh votes more often with Roberts than he does with Alito and Thomas. But with the departure of Kennedy, Chief Justice Roberts then has moved to that center position and is the median justice, which means that he is likely to be the 5th and deciding vote in cases that split 5-4 along ideological lines. But then Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died in 2020, creating a vacancy, and her departure from the court was very close to the election. But President Trump, nonetheless, went ahead and nominated and appointed Amy Coney Barrett to replace Ginsburg on the court. And so Justice Barrett hasn't really cast enough votes yet to make any determination. Although from all press accounts and analysis of how she voted in her brief time as an appellate court judge, it suggests that Justice Barrett is going to become a solid conservative vote on the Supreme Court. And so we'll just have to wait and see how that happens. So that's just an overview of how the ideological balance on the Supreme Court has changed, and as I said, I've based those estimates on as much information as I can find, but much of that analysis is speculative, especially with the case of Justice Barrett, because we're gonna see later that sometimes presidents are surprised at how their appointments vote, and so that brings us to the next point that I want to see that I want to talk about, and that is that we can predict how a justice or how someone is going to vote on the Supreme Court when they are appointed, but there's a lot of room for error. I'd like to start this discussion with this famous quote from President Truman when he was president. He made the comment when he was asked about the Supreme Court appointment or something, and he was probably reacting to the court packing proposal that Franklin Roosevelt had proposed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, to add justices to the Supreme Court so he could change the ideological balance. But President Truman said, and this is a quote, "Packing the Supreme Court simply can't be done. I tried, and it won't work." A little bit of analysis suggests that Truman was only partially right. That we have some evidence that how justices' votes are predictable before they get there, but sometimes presidents predict wrong. And so here is the evidence. Now let me tell you how this works. Some political scientists, Jeff Siegel and Albert Cover, did an extensive study where they went through letters to the editor, opinion pieces written by legal scholars and legal analysts in major national publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post and so forth, all the way back to justices appointed as early as 1937. And so when a Supreme Court vacancy comes up, this is news. The major newspapers report it. Legal scholars, legal analysts, and so forth. They express their opinions or their assessment of the individual that has been nominated. So Professor Siegel and Cover did a content analysis of all of these op-ed pieces that they could find in national newspapers and publications about Supreme Court appointments. And based on that content analysis, they were able to place these future nominees on a liberal conservative scale based on the analysis of what these experts expected they would be, how liberal, moderate, or conservative they were expected to be based on these opinion pieces published before they joined the court. So these numbers are arbitrary numbers. I place this on a scale ranging from a negative 0.6 to a positive 0.6, and so with a 0.6 meaning that this was a justice that was supposed to be very liberal. 0 means that they were going to be moderate, and a plus 0.6 means that they were expected to be very conservative. And then I took that same civil liberties support scale that we've talked about before, and I rescaled it so that it would be on the same scale, going from a -6 to a +6. And so then I just plotted that actual liberalism against the expected liberalism. And so there's there's the plot of all of the justices that were analyzed back to 1937. And so, as you can see, there's a reasonable correlation, an R squared of 0.41. So that's a respectable correlation. But notice that, and there's a positive slope, which means that if they were expected to be conservative, low on expected liberalism, they also scored low on actual liberalism, and if they were expected to be conservative, they tended to actually turn out in both that way. But notice that there are very many cases right along this regression line that some of them are off. And so let's look at some of the outliers and see if we can discern any patterns. I want to start with Justice Minton and Chief Justice Vinson. These are President Truman's appointments to the Supreme Court, the ones he said, the court can't be packed, I've tried, and it won't work, because he was very disappointed with these two appointments that he made to the Supreme Court. As you can see, these two appointees were expected to be moderately liberal, but instead of being down here and actually voting in the liberal direction most of the time, they voted in the conservative direction. So President Truman predicted wrong in that case, and he was disappointed. Here are some other instances of some justices for which the president was disappointed. Let me start with Earl Warren here. Earl Warren was a Republican. He'd been governor of California and attorney general of California. President Eisenhower appointed him as Chief Justice to the Supreme Court in 1953. And Warren was expected to be a moderate liberal based on the analysis of Siegel and Cover. And he turned out to be, a fairly liberal justice, and became infamous from a conservative point of view, as the leader of the so-called liberal Warren Court, the court that was responsible for all of these liberal decisions, going from Brown versus Board of Education to Baker versus Carr and Westbury versus Sanders, the reapportionment cases that we talked about, to the criminal procedure cases that we didn't talk about, but the controversial cases that put limits on the police, the Miranda versus Arizona, and other criminal procedure cases that conservatives were very unhappy with, and President Eisenhower expressed some disappointment that Earl Warren was so liberal, although based on the analysis from Siegel and Cover, it's really not that much of a surprise. But here are some others that were disappointed. John Paul Stevens was appointed by President Ford, his one appointment in the brief time he was there. Justice Stevens was a conservative, and he was expected to be fairly moderate. And then a few years later, John Souter, or David Souter, was appointed by George Herbert Walker Bush, the senior Bush, and he was expected to be a moderate conservative. While these two individuals were serving together on the Supreme Court, they became the core and anchored the liberal bloc on the Supreme Court. And so President Ford and Bush and other Republicans were very unhappy that these two justices that were supposed to be conservative and vote conservative turned out to be to compile a fairly liberal record. Justice Blackmun, Harry Blackmun, was one of President Eisenhower's first two appointments to the Supreme Court. He appointed Warren Burger to be Chief Justice, who was an appellate judge at Minnesota. And Harry Blackmun served on that same appellate court in Minnesota. And for the first few years, he established a relatively conservative voting record and voting very similarly to Chief Justice Burger. But as time went on, he began to consistently move in the liberal direction and to vote more and more liberal. And he is the justice who wrote the opinion in Roe versus Wade and became a very big disappointment to many conservatives. So these are some of the outliers. But when we look across all of the cases, and I put the names of a few that you may have heard of, that most of the time presidents, the justices they appoint, vote pretty much the same way that they want. President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, appointed Thurgood Marshall and Abe Fortas. They were expected to be liberal, and they were among the most liberal justices serving on that so-called liberal Warren court. Here's former Chief Justice Rehnquist, who was one of the most conservative justices, and he was expected to be conservative. He was. And here's Scalia, Alito, and Thomas were expected to be very conservative, and they were. Chief Justice Roberts was also expected to be a conservative, and so for the first few years he was on the court, he did vote mostly with Thomas, Alito, and Scalia. As I said, in recent times he has moderated his position a little bit. And then here, Justice O'Connor and Kennedy. As we noted, Kennedy was that median justice for a while, and before him, before she left, O'Connor, Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman justice, often voted with Kennedy. But when we look, we can see that they were expected to be moderately conservative, and they did compile a mostly conservative record. So most of the time, when justices, when the president appoints a justice and expects them to be liberal or conservative, it turns out that way. Now, another issue of decision making involves a judicial philosophy, the philosophy of whether it's appropriate for judges to exercise what's called judicial restraint or judicial activism. Now, judicial restraint just refers to a judicial philosophy that judges should follow the precedents, decisions made in previous cases with similar facts and conditions, and that they should refrain from striking down laws and actions of elected policymakers unless there's a clear violation of constitutional rights and constitutional limitations. A judicial activism, an activist judge or activist judges are sometimes referred to as acting like legislators in robes. A legislator, but in a judicial robe. And when judicial activism or legislators in robes is referred to, it's generally a pejorative term that describes, that's intended to describe a judge that votes or acts to try and overturn precedents and to strike down actions, laws and acts of elected policymakers in order for that activist judge to advance their own personal policy preferences. And in the heated political environment of our time, it's generally conservatives who criticize judicial activism, and conservative writers and opinion leaders, conservative opinion leaders, generally argue that conservatives, a conservative ideology, a conservative philosophy, is a philosophy of a judge that would exercise judicial restraint, and it's those liberals that act as judicial activists and try to overturn the laws and precedents that they don't like. Well, let's look at the data. Let's test this perception of that conservatives exercise judicial restraint, whereas liberals are the judicial activists. And so here's analysis. This judicial activism score is similar to the ones we've been talking about before, except the same source where I got the percentage of pro-civil liberties votes. These scholars also went through the decisions, and in all cases that overturned a precedent, or in all cases that declared a law passed by Congress unconstitutional, they calculated what percentage of the time each justice voted to overturn the precedent or declare a law unconstitutional. And so what I did is that, just based on that ideology scale that we've been talking about, I just divided all of the justices in that scale, in that study, into three categories. The most liberal third of the justices, the middle third of the justices, and the most conservative third of the justices, and then just calculated the average of how often each liberal, moderate, or conservative group voted in an activist direction. And what we see is that judicial activism is not so much associated with liberals or conservatives. Instead, it's associated with ideological extremism. And so what we see from that is that it's the strongly ideological justices, the most liberal justices and the most conservative justices that tend to vote in a more activist direction, and it's the moderates that are less likely, moderate conservatives and moderate liberals that are less likely to vote in an activist direction. So what this means is that both conservatives and liberals are inclined to support judicial activism, substituting their own personal preferences for those of other policymakers, if that advances their own strongly held ideological preferences. And we also might note, for historical accuracy, the first and most infamous set of judicial activists were the conservatives on the Supreme Court during the New Deal, that for the first term of President Roosevelt's term as president, they were declaring most of the New Deal legislation that was designed to deal with the Great Depression as unconstitutional. And so at that time it was liberals that were complaining about the activist judges and wanting to do something about that. I'm not going to present evidence on this, but we also know from our studies that lower court judges, appellate court judges, federal district court judges, there have been studies of that, and it shows there that party and ideology influence votes of lower court judges in a similar way that we see on the Supreme Court. So this concludes our discussion of judicial decision making, and so we'll conclude next time with a discussion of judicial review in a democratic system.